That, I think we're ready to move into the industry perspective. And so I'd like to introduce Mr. Dan Murray, the Senior Vice President for the American Transportation Research Institute. So Dan has more than 26 years of experience in trucking research and economics, transportation safety technologies, and autonomous vehicles. As Senior Vice President for ATRI, he is responsible for managing ATRI's transportation research, testing, and evaluation, and leads multiple national activities. Welcome, Dan.
Is there anybody who has heard of ATRI before? Because I have like 3 slides of infomercial that will bore those people, and I'll move on from that. So ATRI is a 501c3 not-for-profit. I promised Brenda I am not going to go over, so my stopwatch is running. And we do research in all these areas here. Certainly you're familiar with these topics. So we've been doing research since 1954. In the old days, back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, we were called the ATA Foundation. But about 2000, we reincarnated as the American Transportation Research Institute. All of our research is available online, free of charge, once it's completed or published at this website that you can see here. Mark, I thought you deliberately left because you knew I was coming up here. Definitely go to our website and put your name in, and all our research then gets pushed out to you automatically. Oh, don't do that, Dan. I have a board of directors made up of presidents and CEOs of these companies. Certainly you're familiar with them. The one in the middle, and she's now resigning, you may not be familiar with, but that's former FMCSA Administrator Annette Sandberg. My board chairman is Judy McReynolds, who's the chairman of ABF ArcBest. They're not in the room right now. Excuse me. So I'll tell you, this is a much more important, well, maybe equally important group for us, the Research Advisory Committee. I haven't updated all the logos here yet. Our existing law enforcement representative is California Highway Patrol. Previously, you would have seen the Colorado State Patrol up there. Mark Savage, well represented Colorado for many years on our Research Advisory Committee. In fact, he jump-started research that we've been undertaking on the impact of legalizing marijuana on the trucking industry. And I'll tell you, Mark, that our board last week in San Antonio approved basically a phase 2 looking at the impact of Schedule I drugs on multiple titles within the trucking industry. So it won't be just the truck driver, safety directors, dock operators, et cetera, et cetera. And as the expanding legalization or decriminalization occurs, that's going to be a very, very big issue for our industry. I'm booting this up because now I'm going to talk to you about COVID. So we survey every year thousands and thousands of motor carrier executives, thousands of truck drivers. We've been doing it for more than a decade. What's interesting is we do that survey over the course of the summer, working with all kinds of associations, driver groups, et cetera. And then we release the results in October. And so in the thick of 2020, in the thick of the discussion of COVID, what's missing? What's really, really interesting is you don't see COVID or a pandemic in that list. In fact, if you go so far as to break out truck drivers from executives, you see a lot of critical issues. In fact, truck parking hit the #1 issue for truck drivers for the first time ever, but it had always been floating in the 2 and 3 slot. But again, nothing about the pandemic, nothing about COVID's immediate impacts. And we thought that was very, very interesting. It did hit the list, just not the top 10 list. And we thought that was very interesting. And the ultimate conclusion, as I'll share with you some data-related slides, is that the industry is reactive and proactive and basically takes what's given to them on a day-to-day, monthly basis, and they just keep pushing forward. Obviously, they were essentially an essential worker during the middle of COVID, but that never sort of stopped them when it came to big industry issues. They were looking much more long-term. So I'm going to scale through this topic of how did COVID impact the trucking industry and the economy in general. I borrowed some economic slides from ATA's chief economist, Bob Costello. Clearly here you can see COVID had a major impact for a very short time period. What's interesting in retail sales, and retail sales are 2/3 of this country's economy, is we immediately reacted. We basically panicked. Then we went out and bought 600 rolls of toilet paper, as Joe mentioned. But then things got back to business as usual. It is true, as Joe indicated, different sectors were impacted differently. The petroleum industry tanked like you can't imagine. That's a pun, tanked. You can't imagine because nobody's driving, and when you're not driving, you're not burning gas. And quite candidly, an unintended consequence of that is if you're not burning gas, you're not paying anything into the state and federal highway trust funds. So those things are gutted severely right now as we speak. But again, you see some pretty immediate reactions. Here is sort of an interesting look-see at Americans slowly but surely replacing grocery store purchases and at-home meals with restaurants. But then, of course, everything's closed, restaurants plummet, but they're coming back again, and we'll be back in this 21st century of everyone wants to eat out, nobody wants to cook at home. But the good news is, again, the rebound is really very, very quick. In fact, some data I'll show you in a second, well, in this slide as well, is you can see, by the way, 2011, as you all know, was the end of the Great Recession. A terrible, terrible economy, frankly, the worst economy in US history outside of the Great Depression. And you can see from an index standpoint where the Great Recession took us when we came out of it. Well, now you see COVID. It was bad, but it didn't slow anything down. In fact, 2020 saw some of the record sales for houses and new home permit sales. So it was catastrophic in March through June, but again, most of the data shows a very, very quick rebound. Manufacturing, same thing. When you're working from home, you can't run conveyor belts and move in durable goods, so we saw that. That green is sort of this speculated, estimated data or trend line based on the Federal Reserve. 2021 is going to be a hot economy if nothing goes south unexpectedly. They're talking 4 to 6% GDP growth, which is 2 to 3 times what we'd normally have even in a good year. So 2021 will be a good year, but again, you can see the impact of COVID in the short run. So when it comes to ATRI research, we did a whole bunch of things in 2020 that sort of documented the before, during, and sort of the post-recovery time period. First of all, ATRI in real time monitors more than 1 million, in fact, 1.4 million trucks in North America. These are embedded GPS units. It's not a Garmin walking around or a smartphone walking around. So we did some data with that. I'll show you in a second, data analysis. We also partnered with OOIDA on a survey, and I had some detractors say, oh, the industry is just too busy to answer surveys. In 2 weeks, we had over 5,000 responses. More than 3/4 of those were truck drivers, which is excellent because we really wanted to know, boots on the ground, what was happening with COVID. So in that analysis, and I'm just going to give you a couple teasers, you can go grab that research right off our website if you're interested. We saw some very interesting trends. One of them, not necessarily surprising, but I'm very curious to see how long it lasts, is a huge movement away from long haul trucks and truck trips to short haul and regional. And some of that we started to see before COVID, thanks to e-commerce and our ability to eat and breathe on the internet. But this was a dramatic change, 10%, 15% changes in these trip lengths and driver activities. And so I'm very interested, and we're going to be running this data again next month, in fact, to see post-recovery, post-COVID, if any of this stuff is sort of a permanent change. If it is, the long-haul truck driver shortage that we experience today, which is not a shortage, it's a crisis by any definition, will be dramatically exacerbated by this data that we're looking at. So we did use our GPS data, and in the GPS data, we can monitor truck travel speeds anywhere in the country. And what you see in this first slide is what we saw in dozens and dozens of states, which is essentially, and you heard it earlier, there's no commuters on the road. Trucks were moving 24/7. And with a huge thank you and kudos to FMCSA, the exemptions helped a lot to maintain the 24/7. But in particular, the lack of morning and afternoon rush hours, we never saw decreases in truck speeds. With the exception, and I threw in one slide here just to make that point, when you have infrastructure impediments, which have nothing to do with commuter congestion, in this case, it's basically the George Washington Bridge. infrastructure impediments are one of the single biggest barriers to more efficient operations in trucking and even on the roadway. So obviously this industry is advocating hard for new infrastructure bill, but generally the trucks are moving 24/7, which is very important, again, along with the exemptions, you know, moving paper goods, frozen foods, but essential goods to nursing homes and hospitals. As Joe indicated, we saw huge sector increases in commodities that we really didn't expect. Nobody knows enough about COVID at that time period to know what was coming and what was going. But it was exciting in the GPS data to see this huge increase in activity, particularly in urban areas. We then converted, so that was truck speeds. We then converted the GPS pings into a truck activity index. And we did this with about a dozen states. I'd love to say we did all 50. I don't think we did Colorado, with great apologies. But what we saw, again, is a baseline of February when everything's normal. We're supposed to have a phenomenal economy in 2020, by the way. And then COVID hit. So we saw an immediate reaction of things are bad. Then we saw the hoarding with just a slight uptick in the March, April time period. And then everything goes south. Certain sectors did well still. But generally the economy, reflected in the GPS data, was not doing well. But most importantly, when everyone thought, you know, we were truly in the doldrums, we see this uptick, which started in April, May, and June, a slight uptick. That uptick kept growing to the point where about October, we were at 85 to 90% of baseline or normal operations. We particularly saw it with certain sectors. So Michigan, you know, manufacturing intensive, Detroit auto manufacturing, you name it, they bottomed out very, very quickly. But look at that steep incline in the trend line. And again, that went up to at least 90% of normal operations by that October, November time period. So while the COVID impact from a health standpoint and even from an employment standpoint was catastrophic by any definition, the trucking industry did not see that to the same degree, you know, sans that March time period. Certainly representative of the economy and the industry, it gave us a hint when the rest of us were in the doldrums and deep depression that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Couple more slides here. This is one of the single biggest opportunities we have in terms of collaboration between the trucking industry and government. When we surveyed motor carriers of every size, from the very largest of the large down to owner operators, we discovered this sort of inverse relationship. And this is a little painful. You know, our graphics people have too much fun with colors, I guess. But essentially, blue means before COVID hit, you had emergency response preparedness plans in place. And no question, the bigger the fleet, the more likely you were prepared for things like, you know, Hurricane Harvey and Irma and bridge closures, and certainly COVID, at least at some scale. The smaller you were, the less likely you were to have any preparedness plans in place. Knowing that someday, hopefully hundreds of years from now, we're going to have another pandemic or another global crisis, the opportunity right now is to work with government and industry collaboratively to get everybody, particularly small fleets, which based on US DOT registrations, 96% of all fleets in the United States are 20 and fewer trucks. Those folks really need to get up to speed. Granted, they might have 5 employees, they might have 50 employees, but we have to work to get those people up to speed. And then the future impact of a pandemic or global crisis won't be as catastrophic for us as an industry. A couple other little factoids that came out of the research that we did, particularly with OOIDA. Truck parking, which is the #1 issue for truck drivers now, got worse during COVID. And that is mostly any Colorado State DOT people in the room. I think somebody said yes earlier there was. Okay, so maybe not, so I can blame them. A lot of state DOTs thought, well, we got to keep the cars moving and keep the cars heading home because we're all on, you know, work at home orders. So they were closing public rest stops. Well, you folks know how the industry works. And we have this thing called hours of service compliance, fatigue management, staging, you name it. When public rest stops closed in about 16 states or more, it became very, very challenging. What's interesting, it was much more challenging as an issue, truck parking, for the large fleets. And the small guys always had their favorite sweet spots, and they would never tell us where those were, but those were still available. And so the small fleets didn't have as big a problem. However, driver detention, which is always a big issue for this industry, got substantially worse. And that did hit the small guys much more so. Driver detention, which again is defined, at least in the industry, as being stuck at a shipper receiver facility for more than 2 hours. That's the start of the detention clock. You know, we would show up at a dock and there'd be one guy working it, or frankly, the shipper facility was completely closed. And I'm sitting on a residential road making phone calls trying to figure out where my load is going to come from. So detention was very, very problematic for us. Now, that is officially the end of the discussion for COVID for 2020. We're running the new data with OOIDA and our GPS folks. And again, it looks like in 2021, the first quarter, we're at about 115% of what the COVID baseline was. And I'm even talking pre-March. So the industry is essentially recovered. Our big issues now, of course, will be the truck driver shortage. We did get a comment a little earlier about inexperienced truck drivers. I wish we had more inexperienced truck drivers, at least, you know, applying and getting hired so that we can run them through driver training programs, but the shortage is still a big issue. So a couple other comments, if, you know, sort of the speaker's prerogative to sort of step outside of my topic area. I really appreciated the gentleman's question about, you know, what is FMCSA doing about car drivers, the infamous four-wheelers. And at least some philosopher years ago, about 100 years ago, said, people who choose to ignore history are condemned to repeat it. So I'm just going to throw some statistics at you that I think are very, very powerful for us. And that's about 1999, the US DOT did the first crash causation study that I'm aware of. And I've been in the industry 27, 28 years now. And they found out, based on US data, that the primary factor, the causal factor, they use all kinds of terms throughout these, so I'm just going to say blame, if I may, that 71% of the time the primary blame was given to the car driver. A year later, Transport Canada, coincidentally using their Canadian data, found out that 71% of the time the Canadian car drivers received the causal factor in car truck crashes. AAA Foundation, which is the AAA, said no way our members are that responsible. So the AAA Foundation did their own deep dive into car truck crashes and primary factors. Shockingly, they came up with 75% of the time the car drivers were primarily responsible. AAA initially wasn't going to release that study, so Dave Willis, who was the president of the AAA Foundation, he resigned and he went to the Texas Transportation Institute. They ultimately released it, and we could, you know, pour through the data. Some of the safety advocates were very concerned about those data points. And so the University of Michigan did a study in about 2006 where they only used injury and property damage only crashes. So everyone's basically alive to be interviewed, and found out that 68% of the time the car driver is primarily responsible. And the last statistic, because Joe mentioned it, as did the deputy administrator, FMCSA's large crash causation study found out that 56% of the time, the most conservative number out there, 56% of the time the car driver is primarily responsible. That same study found out that car drivers were more than twice as fatigued as truck drivers in car truck crashes. And that was an injury fatality crash. I'm very concerned, I'm super excited because Joe's starting a new study, a new large truck crash causation study, 2,000 severe crashes, which is double what the last one was. And I'm very certain we're going to start to see terrible things like tripling and quadrupling of driver distraction related, particularly among car drivers. As advanced technologies penetrate the industry, I'm very concerned that the relationship in the large truck crash causation, oh, we got to fix that name. That had 89% of the time the crashes were human factor related, 11% vehicle components. With technology just pouring into the industry, both car and truck, I could see components and technology having an increasing role in crashes, not because they're bad in any way, shape, or the form, but we're just starting to see, you know, error codes and misunderstandings of how technologies work and don't work. So I'm concerned about that, but I'm super excited that Joe's going to be doing this next study. To give Joe and FMCSA credit though, because we had a couple questions about technology, they are now funding what I think is a really exciting program focused on advanced driver assistance systems. And because ADAS is really tough to say, it doesn't roll off your tongue, particularly after happy hour, we've changed the name. ATRI's involved, OOIDA's involved in this, ATA is involved. We changed the name to Texcelerate Now, texceleratenow.org. If you Google it, you can go to the website. We do have data on the efficacy of 12 advanced systems. We have some videos and some other cool stuff. But I'm excited about this in particular because the question was posed to FMCSA, what are you doing about car drivers? The power of advanced driving systems, which are sort of the autonomous systems, and then advanced driver assistance systems, is they don't care who's to blame. They don't care about negligence. They just stop crashes or at least mitigate the severity of many of these crashes. Automated emergency braking, lane keeping assist. FMCSA has even approved electronic mirrors, which have a much, much wider field of view, and believe it or not, can improve fuel economy by 1% to 2%. So all of this is a win-win. This stuff is coming. Don't go bank on level 5 autonomous trucks anytime soon, although Mark Savage was one of the sort of co-creators of a Guinness Book of World Record Colorado beer run trip in 2016. It was awesome. I got to watch it live. So that's not coming anytime soon, but level 2, level 3 advanced driving systems are almost here today. We're going to see a lot more of those. And that's where I think we're going to see some huge exponential improvements in safety. So I'm going to shut up now, Brenda, because I'm at 21 minutes. But I appreciate the time, and I can do Q&A now or later. It's totally up to you.
Yeah, I think a couple questions did come in online. So Dustin, if you wouldn't mind reading those off.
Yeah, the first one's a comment and a question. It's very interesting to see the trend of average length of haul changes by an ATRI study. So wondering, what is the time window for before pandemic and during pandemic definitions in the ATRI study? And also, if you could kindly refer to the name of the study or a web link, that would be great.
So I can answer that first one easy. What was the second part of the question?
I was wondering, what is the time window for before pandemic and during pandemic?
Yeah, that's the easy one. So we ran both the data and the survey between March 15 and the first week in June. So that's the easy one. And that's the time period we saw the change. That's a very short window, you know, essentially a 4-month window to see huge shifts in trip lengths. Again, we're seeing, you know, nearly $1 in $4 spent in the United States now is online. So we know that e-commerce has played a role in that, but not that dramatic a shift in a 4-month period. Now, it's that second part of the question I didn't hear.
He was just looking for the name or a web link of the study.
Oh, just go to truckingresearch.org and go under, you'll see all our research organized. Just look under COVID research. By the way, to be, you know, fair disclosure, if anybody wants the citations or references on any of those crash responsibility reports or studies, let me know, because we have them all on our website.
All right, one more question. Has there been a trend or change in the size of the CMV being used in commerce? CDL CMVs versus non-CDL CMVs?
Okay, so I need about 4 hours to answer that one. Remember, by the way, very interesting that we're up to 46 states have exemptions from the 80,000 pound rule. Some of them, for instance, Maine has a 100,000 pound truck on the interstate system as a congressional exemption from about 4 or 5 years ago. We're also seeing increases in truck weights. We're seeing a massive increase in, you know, everyone's got a different classification system. So I'm going to say a massive increase in US DOT registrations for 10,000 to 26,000 pound trucks, which is e-commerce proper. In fact, double-digit increases. We're seeing about 4 or 5% increases in class 7-8 trucks, the 18-wheelers. So everything is increasing in terms of the number of trucks on the road, but a big, I won't call it shift, but a big shift in share to basically medium-duty trucks, light-duty trucks. Heck, I know people who are delivering, you know, Amazon packages out of their trunk of their car. Not sure State Farm knows they're doing that, but yeah, we're seeing shifts in share from larger trucks to smaller trucks, and it's almost exclusively an e-commerce phenomenon. I don't know if that's exactly an answer to your question, but it's an answer.
Thanks, Dan.